Once you have the basics of Listen Layer implemented, you can start to do some really cool things to enhance the quality of your data. Imagine if you could tell your entire marketing team to throw a small parameter on their URL when they visit the website in order to easily filter out their website activity from your conversion tracking and analytics collection. I'm going to show you how easy this is to do inside of Listen Layer with no programming and no ongoing maintenance. If you're new to Listen Layer, it's important to note that you need to have your domain name defined, and you have to have your script placed on all the pages of your website and your changes published. Otherwise, Listen Layer is not going to work. Now, the other thing you need to do is you need to enable some listeners. So today, we're going to focus on a listener called URL parameters. This is one of the user activity listeners that allows you to identify characteristics and actions that a user takes on your website that don't necessarily apply to an application such as a form or a chat tool. And it looks like I've hit my limit in my test account. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off one of my other listeners that I've been testing. And that will allow me to enable my URL listener. Now, once this listener is enabled, you'll need to jump to the features screen to enable the actual features. Otherwise, nothing is actually going to work. And I recommend focusing on the features that are labeled under an activity filter. These are the particular features that actually push information into the data layer in the user's browser. In this case, when the listener sees a URL parameter on any page that the user views, it's going to grab those and parse them, and it's going to push them into the data layer along with an event called URL parameters. And this can be really powerful because you can start to, without any programming and on any page of the website, you can pull down parameters and you can start to use those directly in your web analytics, or you can use them to write custom rules that push data back into the data layer for other purposes. So we're going to enable this capture parameters. And note that when you jump to the event settings screen, this screen on all the listeners will list the events that the listener can push into the data layer. And usually one feature will correspond to one or more events, features, specifically these activity features. And so you can see that now that we have our activity feature turned on, our event is also turned on. And lastly, if you are new to Listen Layer or to this listener in particular, this screen is most likely going to be empty when you first enable the listener. And that's because the listener needs to actually run on your website and see some of the information that it's going to automatically collect from the user's activity. And then it'll make those variables that appear in the data layer available here. So for example, we've run this before, and so we can see that there are a bunch of URL parameters that our website has already collected and seen in past visits. And we have one here already called test. And that's the one that we're going to be using today. But don't get confused if you don't have any variables here. Then what you need to do is make sure your features are turned on and then publish your changes. Once those are published, you can just visit your website with a URL parameter that you want to actually utilize, and the listener will automatically see that URL parameter, and within a matter of moments, it'll be available underneath parameters here as a variable. And once it's available here, you can use it to write rules. So that's what we're going to do today. And before we jump into our demo site, we're just going to actually go ahead and configure the actual rule to identify that a user is a test user. So we're going to jump back to features, and we're going to click on customization and storage. And we're going to enable the custom data layer values feature. Now, this allows you to write rules that push values into variables in the data layer that we define. So you'll notice that when I enabled this, we have a new menu item down here called custom values. That's where I'm going to actually write the rules for this listener. But before I do that, I need to make sure I have some variables to actually push values into. And those exist at the global level. And that's because these variables can have rules written for them across all of your listeners. So let's go ahead and we're going to create one called test user. And while we're at it, it might be, so this is a custom data layer variable, and data layer information doesn't really persist as much as we might want it to. Google Tag Manager can read the data layer and it will have a cumulative version of the data layer as additional information is pushed into the data layer. But it doesn't necessarily persist a specific value across a user's entire session. And so we might not only want to store a custom value into the data layer when we see a test user, we could also store what's called a browser storage variable. And this is where you can create an actual first-party cookie, or you can create a local storage key or session storage. So if you're not familiar with that, let me take just a moment to explain. If you jump into most common browsers and you take a look at the application screen, you'll see a section here called storage. And this is where all of your cookies and other information are saved to your browser. And everyone's familiar with the fact that third-party cookies are going away. We are not talking about third-party cookies here. We're talking about first-party cookies. Visitors on your website are your visitors, and as long as you have permission overall, you can store cookies on their browser. Now, if you have to adhere to something like GDPR, it's important to understand that those would apply to these identifying cookies as well. In this case, however, we're not actually writing a personal identifying cookie, just kind of a generically identifying cookie to identify all users that might be test users. So cookies are stored here and they have a name, but there's also other types of storage. There's session storage, which has a key, and there's local storage. And the difference between session storage and local storage is just simply how they persist. Session storage will only exist until essentially the browser tab is closed, and then the values will go away. Whereas local storage would persist longer, depending on the actual browser itself. And cookies can potentially persist even longer and can be accessed server-side, whereas these have some different functionality around them. The idea, though, here is that maybe during a user's test session, I just want to label them as a test session, and then I can reference that and I can use that in Google Tag Manager, which we're not going to show the full details of that inside of this use case. So the other feature that I probably want to turn on here is the browser storage feature. So I'm going to go ahead and enable that. And then I'm going to jump back to my browser storage, and I've noticed that I already have a session storage key called test user. So this has been created previous. So now I have two variables. I have a data layer variable that I want to define, and I have a browser storage variable that I want to define. So let's jump into custom values. These are my custom data layer values, and these are my browser storage values. And I'm going to go ahead and create a rule, and I'm just going to make it a simple rule. And you can explore the lookup table rules further after you understand the basics of rule writing. So in this case, what we care about is that a particular variable contains a value. And we know that this variable is going to be the parameter test. And this will make sense. I'll jump to my website here, and I'll just throw a parameter on my URL string called test. And I want that to equal 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell all my internal marketing team, hey, when you visit the site, please just throw test equals 1 on there. And that way I can more easily filter you out from our analytics tracking. So the listener from Listen Layer will automatically detect that this parameter exists. And because we've already just made this change and we had published our Listen Layer account, you can see our URL parameters listener is already working, and it's already parsed this URL, and you can see there's a list of parameters here. So let's just throw on another parameter. We're going to put 2, and that way you can just get a little better look here at how those parameters might be listed out if there's multiples of them. And the one we care about is this test one. So once our listener sees these particular parameters, they're going to appear under variable settings, where I kind of showed you this earlier in the video. And that's how I'm able to pull this parameters.test into this value. And I'm going to show you an easier way to do this in a second, but let's move forward. We're going to say this needs to contain the value 1. And if that's the case, then I want my test user data layer value to say, to actually have this value of like test user. You can actually insert other values, kind of like a merge code, or a merge code inside of like an email system, for example. You can take other values from the data layer and you can push those in to your custom values. But I'm going to go ahead and save this. And then I'm going to show you back in the variable screen an easier way to identify your variable. So what you'll notice is that as you use listen layer for a prolonged period of time, you're going to end up with a lot of variables. And they might be hard to identify. And so rather than having to search for the path to this variable, we could just name this. We could just call this test user identification variable. Now, this will not change the name in the data layer or on the website itself. It'll just change it inside of listen layer. And that way, when I'm writing my rules, it makes it a little bit easier to actually find my variable, because I could literally just search for test user identification variable instead of having to deal with all these long variable paths. So the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go into browser storage and I'm going to create some browser storage. And in this case, we want a session storage. We want to identify that this is a session. For the length of the session, we want to identify that this is a test. And we are going to be looking at our automatic variables. In browser storage and in another feature called monitoring, you can actually use your custom variable values in your rules. But in this case, we're going to be looking at test user identification variable. We want it to contain the value 1. And we are going to set the value for a key, the session storage key called test user, which we defined up here. And we're going to call this a test session. And if there's a value in this key already, we want to just go ahead and overwrite the existing value. There are some options where you can not overwrite it, which would be if you want to, always save the first value of something in browser storage. And then there's also the ability to chain values together as a comma delimited list. And we might have some more values in here in the future, like a URL encoded string, for example. So we're going to go ahead and save this. And now when this parameter exists, we are going to see those values be stored in the user's browser or pushed into the data layer. So this is going to be test user identification rules. And again, sometimes I like to just do a hard refresh just to make sure we get the latest version of everything. And what we'll notice right away, it didn't take any time at all, but I'm looking at session storage right now, and we see this value popped up called test user test session. And that's the listener at work. The listener has identified that I have this URL parameter, and it just automatically stores this as an individual session key and value. And of course, if I had written a browser storage rule for cookies or for local storage, then I would see that same thing here. So automatically, we know that this is already working, but let's take a look at our data layer. We'll go to our latest view here of the URL parameters, and we'll notice that now we have this value called URL custom values test user equals test user. If we go to our previous version here, before I had kind of refreshed the site, that custom value did not exist, even though the URL was exactly the same. So now our listener is applying, it's parsing the URL, it's grabbing this parameter, and then it's applying the rules to push a custom value into the data layer. Now, this is very powerful because we can grab onto things like session storage keys and test users inside of Google Tag Manager. And the most common way of doing this would be to just focus on the data layer value. So let's do that. We're going to get this value test user, and we're going to make it available inside of Google Tag Manager. And notice that this view, this is the actual data layer push that Listen Layer is making on the user's browser, the visitor on your website. This then is Google Tag Manager reading the data layer and showing the cumulative version of the data layer. So you can notice that this says data layer values after this message. It's kind of a cumulative view of all your data layer pushes together up to this point. The latest values will always override previous values. But just because Google Tag Manager sees this and makes it available as a message doesn't mean we can actually use any values from there. They have to be available as variables inside of here. And the easiest way to get one of these custom variables is to jump to your console and notice our data layer activity appears here also because Listen Layer writes to the console. And we're going to go to URL custom values. We're going to drill into this event, and you can see our new data layer variables here. And I'm just going to expand that so it's open, and I'm going to right click on test user and click copy property path. And then I'm going to go back to Google Tag Manager, and I'm going to create my variable. And this is going to be a data layer variable. So we're going to click new. We're going to select data layer variable under the type. And the name of the variable is the path to the variable. So you can see the path is what I just copied. Now the path is no different than a URL path. There's a parent-child structure, just that it's separated with a period. So if you were to really kind of look at this closely, you'll see that at the top level is this concept of URL custom values. And below that is test user. And that is what we are currently targeting. And so we're just going to call this a test user. And what we can do now is we could actually write a trigger that includes that variable value as an exception so that it blocks our analytics tracking. Now, again, I would probably take this a step further and maybe do it at the session level. So I might be getting that session key into Google Tag Manager. But the idea is once this variable is available, we can use it to write rules. So maybe we just want to block our goals or conversion tracking, like form submissions. In that case, we might have a tag like this one here called, let me just find it, this test chat tag. And this fires when a HubSpot form is submitted. But we have some exceptions to that. And maybe we want to add an additional exception that's going to say, hey, but I don't want to track any form submissions if they are a HubSpot form submission and if my little test user variable that we just defined, I can't remember if it was this one or this one. It looks like I have a couple set up, contains the value test user. This will actually block test user form submissions from occurring on the website. So what we're going to do is, instead of taking that fully to completion, if you've gotten this far, you're probably fairly good at Google Tag Manager, and you can kind of take your actual framework for removing test users and move it forward. What we're going to do, though, is we are going to refresh our preview, and we're going to make sure that that variable that we created now exists. And so what we're going to do is we're going to throw on the parameter again of test equals 1. And we're going to double check that our session, hopefully our session gets set. Oh yeah, it's right at the top now instead of at the bottom. And when we jump back here, we should actually see in our variable screen that we have the test user value available inside of Google Tag Manager to utilize. So now any trigger that's based on kind of URL parameters, or if we're focused on a different scope, for example, like the session storage, then we can use this value to exclude that activity from our analytics platforms by writing a simple rule inside of Google Tag Manager. Listen Layer is extremely powerful. There's some really cool things that you can do. In fact, some things that we haven't even thought about. So we hope you jump in, open a free account, and start using the tool and tell us about the cool things that you build.